Miss Marple replaced the telephone receiver with the careful precision of someone who had just received information that required immediate consideration. The vicar's voice still echoed in her mind, carrying with it all the implications he had been too circumspect to voice aloud. An unknown woman in the house, a theft from the study, the particular way he had said broken into, as though the intruder had been someone from outside rather than a guest already within the manor's walls. These details arranged themselves in her mind like pieces of a puzzle that seemed, at first glance, to form no coherent picture at all. She set aside her correspondence and moved to her bedroom, exchanging her afternoon dress for something more suitable for an evening visit. At her age, Miss Marple had learned that one's appearance carried a particular sort of power in village society, the power of seeming entirely harmless and therefore trustworthy. She selected a coat of soft grey wool, the sort of garment that suggested neither wealth nor poverty, but rather a comfortable respectability, and pinned her hair with the careful attention it deserved. By the time she arrived at Christmas Manor, dusk had already settled over the village like a blanket, and the great house was lit from within in a way that made it seem less welcoming than usual. The drive curved through bare gardens. Mrs. Fellows had grand ideas about landscaping that had not, as yet, come to fruition, and the front entrance was marked by two uniformed police officers who looked decidedly uncomfortable standing in the November cold. Inspector Graves was waiting in the drawing room, a man of perhaps 55 with the sort of face that suggested he had seen rather more of human nature than he found entirely pleasant. He was examining the room with the methodical attention of someone who had performed this task many times before and had long ago ceased to expect it to yield much of interest. When Miss Marple entered, he looked up with a particular expression of resignation that police inspectors typically wore upon encountering elderly amateur detectives. "Miss Marple," he said, with the courtesy that long acquaintance had made habitual. "I must confess, I'm somewhat surprised to see you here. Mrs. Fellows mentioned you might call round." "I happened to be visiting when the vicar telephoned with the news," Miss Marple said, which was not precisely true but was also not precisely false. "I thought I might offer whatever assistance I could, though I realize my presence may be more hindrance than help." This was, of course, the sort of statement designed to make the inspector underestimate her entirely. Miss Marple had perfected this technique over many years, and she watched with quiet satisfaction as Graves' shoulders relaxed slightly. He gestured toward Mrs. Fellows, who was seated in one of the uncomfortable chairs and looking considerably less commanding than usual, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly as she held a handkerchief. "Perhaps you might sit with Mrs. Fellows for a moment," the inspector suggested. "I have a few details still to clarify regarding the timing of events. She's been rather distressed, and I'm sure she would appreciate the company of someone she knows." It was exactly the opening Miss Marple had hoped for. She settled herself beside Mrs. Fellows with the gentle sympathy of one who had spent many years comforting those in distress, and waited. The art of obtaining information from someone in a state of agitation was, she had long ago discovered, largely a matter of allowing them to speak rather than asking direct questions. People in distress, like water, always sought the lowest point, and if one simply provided a receptive space, they would inevitably flow toward it. "It's the humiliation of it," Mrs. Fellows said, after perhaps 2 minutes of silence punctuated only by the sound of her handkerchief being twisted in her trembling hands. "That someone would dare to break into my study, Miss Marple, where I keep my private papers, and with Edward upstairs, no less, and that woman—" "The woman your nephew was with?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "I don't know who she is," Mrs. Fellows said, and there was something in her voice that suggested this ignorance troubled her more than the theft itself. "He simply appeared with her 2 days ago, saying she was a business associate from London and would be staying for a few days. But she doesn't look like any business associate I've ever seen. She's far too young, for one thing. Can't be more than 25. And she dresses in the most extraordinary way. Trousers, Miss Marple, if you can imagine. young women in trousers, as though the world has gone quite mad. "And what is her name?" Miss Marple asked, continuing to knit mentally while keeping her attention focused on the distraught woman beside her. "Eleanor something. Ashford, I think." She claimed to be studying business methods or some such nonsense. Edward said something about her being terribly clever with figures. "But between you and me, Miss Marple, I suspect something rather more irregular is going on. Edward has always been involved in questionable enterprises, but this takes matters to a new level entirely." Before Miss Marple could respond, the inspector returned, along with a young constable who looked even more uncomfortable than the officers outside. The constable was carrying a notebook and had the expression of someone who had recently realized that his job involved a great deal more actual police work than he had anticipated. "We've determined that the study window was forced open from the outside," Inspector Graves explained, directing his comments primarily toward Miss Marple, as though trusting that she would help him make sense of information that Mrs. Fellowes's current emotional state rendered her incapable of processing. "The lock on your writing desk was also forced, Mrs. Fellowes. Can you tell us what was taken?" Mrs. Fellowes' hands trembled more violently. "A document," she said. "A letter from my solicitors regarding the property, and some cash, perhaps £200. "A letter from your solicitors," the inspector repeated, making a note. "Regarding property. Can you be more specific about which property?" "Christmas Manor itself," Mrs. Fellowes said, "and some of the surrounding land. I've been considering selling a portion of the estate. The solicitors had sent me the preliminary documents." Inspector Graves exchanged a glance with his constable, and Miss Marple found herself making a small adjustment to her understanding of the evening's events. A break-in for cash was comprehensible, if unusual. A break-in for a letter regarding property was considerably more interesting. And a break-in carried out while a young woman of questionable provenance was upstairs with Edward Fellowes was interesting in an entirely different way. "I should very much like to speak with your nephew," the inspector said. "Is he available?" Mrs. Fellowes' face darkened. "He's in his room, with her. I've told him not to come down unless summoned." Edward Fellowes descended the main staircase of Christmas Manor with the careful deliberation of a man who was acutely aware of being observed and was determined not to betray any emotion that might be misinterpreted. He was perhaps 35 years old, with the sort of handsome features that suggested a good tailor and regular visits to expensive establishments, though there was something in the set of his jaw that spoke of underlying tension. He wore a dark suit with an impeccable white shirt, and his hair was slicked back with the sort of precision that suggested he had taken considerable time with his appearance before coming downstairs. "Inspector Graves," Edward said, extending his hand with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to social negotiation. "I understand there's been some sort of incident. Mother, that is my aunt, has been quite distressed. I've assured her that I'm certain there's a perfectly reasonable explanation." The inspector shook his hand briefly, his expression revealing nothing. "And what would that explanation be, Mr. Fellowes?" he asked. "According to Mrs. Fellowes, you were in your room when the theft occurred. Is that correct?" "I was," Edward agreed, settling himself into one of the chairs with the same careful precision he had applied to his descent. "Miss Ashford and I were discussing some business matters. We had been working on documents all afternoon and into the evening. We didn't hear anything unusual." "Miss Eleanor Ashford," the inspector said, consulting his notebook. "Your aunt mentioned that Miss Ashford is a business associate from London. What, precisely, is the nature of your business relationship?" There was the slightest hesitation, barely perceptible, but enough for Miss Marple to note it and file it away in the growing collection of observations she was accumulating. Edward's hands were steady, but there was a tightness around his eyes that suggested the question had struck closer to home than he would have preferred. "Eleanor is involved in investment advisory work," Edward said carefully. "I've retained her services to help me with certain financial matters. She's quite capable, despite her age, and comes highly recommended." "And yet," Inspector Graves continued, She doesn't appear in any of the business directories I checked before coming here. No office, no telephone listing, no professional credentials that I could locate. Not everyone in London operates through official channels, Edward said, and now there was a note of defensiveness creeping into his voice. Some of the most successful people in finance prefer to maintain a low profile. I'm sure you understand. Miss Marple, observing this exchange from her position beside Mrs. Fellows, was beginning to form certain conclusions about Edward Fellows. He was a man who had become accustomed to maneuvering through uncomfortable situations, a man who had developed a particular set of responses to interrogation. Whether these responses indicated guilt regarding the current theft or merely guilt regarding some other matter remained to be determined. "I should like to speak with Miss Ashford," the inspector said. "Is she available?" "I'll fetch her," Edward said, rising from his chair with evident relief at the opportunity to leave the drawing room. "Though I should warn you that she's been quite shocked by all of this. She's not accustomed to being involved in criminal matters." As Edward left the room, Miss Marple turned her attention to Mrs. Fellows, who was wringing her handkerchief with renewed vigor. "Tell me," Miss Marple said softly, "has Edward been in financial difficulties? Is that why he's come to stay with you?" Mrs. Fellows glanced around to ensure that the inspector was still occupied with his notebook and the constable was still standing awkwardly near the window. "He lost his position about 6 months ago," she admitted. "Some sort of scandal involving improper handling of client funds. Nothing was proven, you understand, but his firm decided they could no longer employ him. He's been attempting to establish himself in some sort of independent venture ever since." "And has he been successful?" "I don't know," Mrs. Fellows said, her voice dropping even lower. "He claims to be developing some new investment scheme, but he's been rather cagey about the details. I've given him some money, perhaps £50, to help him get started, though I rather suspect he's lost most of it." This information added another layer to the puzzle. A man attempting to rehabilitate his reputation following a professional scandal, a mysterious young woman with no verifiable credentials, and a theft targeting documents related to property that Mrs. Fellows had been considering selling. The pieces seemed to suggest a pattern, though whether they formed the correct pattern or merely the appearance of one remained unclear. Eleanor Ashford, when she appeared a few moments later, proved to be even more remarkable than Mrs. Fellows' description had suggested. She was indeed young, probably no more than 26, and she was dressed in a skirt and jacket of practical wool, with her dark hair pinned in a style that managed to be both contemporary and severe. But it was her eyes that drew attention, intelligent, watchful, and possessed of a quality that Miss Marple recognized immediately as sharp calculation. "I understand there's been a theft," Eleanor said, addressing the inspector with the calm of someone for whom such matters were not entirely unfamiliar. "Though I am afraid I can offer little assistance. Mr. Fellows and I were occupied with work throughout the evening, and neither of us heard anything unusual." "What sort of work?" the inspector asked, watching her carefully. "Financial analysis," Eleanor replied without hesitation. "Reviewing investment portfolios, assessing market conditions. Tedious work, I'm afraid, but necessary for the services we provide." It was a practiced answer, delivered with professional composure. And yet, as Miss Marple watched the young woman's face, she observed something that the inspector, focused on the words being spoken, might have missed. There was a very slight tightening of Eleanor's jaw when she glanced toward Edward, the infinitesimal flicker of something that might have been concern, or might have been something else entirely, something more akin to accusation. Inspector Graves continued his questioning for another quarter of an hour, extracting the details of Edward and Eleanor's evening with the methodical patience of someone who knew that contradictions often revealed themselves only when statements were examined in detail. Yes, they had been in Edward's room since approximately 4 o'clock. No, they had not left at any point. No, they had not heard any sounds from below that might indicate an intruder. Yes, they would both be available for further questioning should it become necessary. When the inspector finally released them, with the understanding that neither was to leave the village without permission, Edward and Eleanor departed with the careful composure of people who had rehearsed their story and found it satisfactory. Miss Marple watched them ascend the staircase, noting the way Eleanor kept her distance from Edward, how she avoided any gesture that might suggest intimacy or conspiracy between them. If anything, the young woman's demeanor suggested something closer to professional detachment, which raised the question of what, precisely, their actual relationship might be. "I think I should be going," Miss Marple said to Mrs. Fellows, who had subsided into exhausted silence. "This has been a trying evening, and you ought to rest. Inspector Graves will likely have his constables remain. Here overnight, I should think. That should give you some peace of mind." "Will you come back tomorrow?" Mrs. Fellows asked, reaching out to grasp Miss Marple's hand with surprising urgency. "I find your presence rather comforting. You have a way of seeing through confusion to what's actually important." "I shall certainly call round in the morning," Miss Marple promised, which was already her intention. She had accumulated enough observations this evening to suggest that a good night's sleep and the perspective of daylight might clarify several matters that currently seemed obscure. The drive back to her cottage took Miss Marple past the church, where the vicar was just extinguishing the lamps. Mr. Hartley emerged from the vestry as her car pulled up, his clerical collar looking somewhat askew, his face marked by the sort of distress that came from having his quiet life disrupted by criminal activity. "Miss Marple," he said, approaching her window, "I'm so glad I've encountered you. I've been rather troubled all evening. You see, there's a matter I feel I should mention, though I'm uncertain if it's relevant." Miss Marple, who had long ago learned that the matters vicars felt uncertain about were invariably the most relevant ones, invited him into the cottage for tea. Within the hour, Mr. Hartley had provided her with information that suggested the evening's theft was considerably more complex than it first appeared. "Eleanor Ashford came to see me 3 days ago," the vicar explained, warming his hands around a cup of tea. "She said she had recently arrived in the village and wanted to attend services, but when we spoke, it became clear that she was asking rather pointed questions about Edward Fellows. Questions about his background, his character, whether I knew anything about his financial dealings." "And did you?" Miss Marple asked. "Very little, I'm afraid. Edward is not a regular churchgoer. But I did mention to her that there had been some gossip in the village about his losing a position in London under circumstances that were not entirely clear. She seemed particularly interested in that detail, and she asked whether I thought him capable of dishonesty." "What did you tell her?" "I said," Mr. Hartley replied slowly, "that I thought most people were capable of dishonesty under the right circumstances, and that Edward's character was likely no different from anyone else's. But I must confess, Miss Marple, I've been wondering all evening whether Eleanor Ashford came to Ashford-in-the-Pines for reasons that have nothing to do with genuine business matters." "An astute observation," Miss Marple said, setting down her own teacup. "Tell me, did she mention anything else? Anything about Mrs. Fellows or about Christmas Manor?" "Now that you mention it," Mr. Hartley said, "she did ask whether Mrs. Fellows was planning to remain in the village, whether she had any property she might be considering selling. I thought it rather an odd question at the time, but I attributed it to natural curiosity about the village and its inhabitants." When the vicar departed an hour later, Miss Marple settled herself in her study with her journal and added several new observations to her growing file on the evening's events. Eleanor Ashford had come to Ashford-in-the-Pines with specific questions about Edward Fellows. She had inquired about his character and his financial dealings. She had asked about Mrs. Fellows' intentions regarding her property. And now, on the very evening of Eleanor's appearance in the village, documents relating to that property had been stolen from Christmas Manor. The coincidence seemed too calculated to be accidental. And yet, the timing was also problematic. If Eleanor had orchestrated the theft, why would she have allowed herself to be discovered in Edward's room at the moment it occurred? Unless, of course, that discovery was entirely deliberate, a form of misdirection designed to ensure that suspicion fell on Edward rather than on herself. But there was another possibility, one that seemed to fit the facts even more precisely. What if Eleanor Ashford had not come to Ashford-in-the-Pines to steal the documents at all? What if she had come for an entirely different reason, and the theft had been committed by someone else entirely? Someone who had been watching and waiting for an opportunity that Eleanor's unexpected arrival had inadvertently created. Miss Marple picked up her pen and added one final note to her journal. The theft may be incidental. Consider who benefits most from the documents being removed. Consider also whether Eleanor Ashford's presence in the village is a cause or merely a convenient cover for someone else's actions. Outside her window, the November night had deepened into complete darkness, and somewhere in the village, someone was doubtless reflecting on how expertly they had executed their plan. But Miss Marple had spent many years learning that plans, no matter how carefully constructed, always contained within them the seeds of their own exposure. One simply had to know where to look. The morning light revealed Christmas Manor in a state of peculiar ordinariness that seemed almost disrespectful to the drama of the previous evening. Inspector Graves's constables had departed, leaving behind only a faint suggestion of official presence in the form of muddy footprints near the study window and a small evidence bag containing the forced lock from the writing desk. Miss Marple arrived at 10:30, carrying a basket of marmalade and the sort of gentle concern that made her presence seem less like an investigation and more like an act of kindness. Mrs. Fellows received her in the morning room, a space considerably less grand than the drawing room and therefore considerably more comfortable. She had slept poorly, the shadows beneath her eyes suggesting that the night had been spent in anxious contemplation rather than rest. Her hands, still, trembled slightly as she poured tea, though whether this was from lingering distress or from the effects of too much coffee remained unclear. "Inspector Graves has been asking the most peculiar questions," Mrs. Fellows said, settling herself into a chair with visible relief at having someone to confide in. "He seems to think that perhaps the theft was not a random burglary at all, but something more deliberate. He kept asking about the property document, about whether anyone else knew of my intentions to sell. I must say, it's rather unsettling to have someone suggest that one's private business dealings might be connected to criminal activity. Has anyone else in the village expressed interest in acquiring any portion of your land?" Miss Marple asked, accepting a cup of tea that was several degrees too hot, but drinking it nonetheless. "The Harringtons have always been interested in expanding their holdings," Mrs. Fellows admitted, "but they certainly wouldn't resort to theft. They're far too established, too comfortable in their position. Besides, they could simply make me an offer if they were genuinely interested." "And your nephew? Would he have reason to be interested in the property?" Mrs. Fellows' teacup halted midway to her lips. "Edward? I hadn't considered. But no, that doesn't make sense. He's staying with me temporarily, but he has no claim on Christmas Manor. My will is quite clear on that point. The estate goes to my daughter." "Your daughter," Miss Marple repeated. "She lives near London, if I recall correctly. Does she visit often?" "Not as often as I should like," Mrs. Fellows said, her voice taking on the particular note of maternal grievance that mothers had employed since time immemorial. "She's quite absorbed in her own life. Her husband keeps her rather busy with his business interests, and they have the children to consider. Edward came down because she asked him to keep an eye on me, I think, though neither of them came right out and said so. My daughter seems to think I've become eccentric in my old age." Before Miss Marple could respond, the door opened and a young woman appeared. Not Eleanor Ashford, but someone new to Miss Marple's observations. She was perhaps 40 years old, dressed in clothes that spoke of London rather than the Cotswolds, with the sort of confident bearing that came from being accustomed to getting one's own way. "Mother," the young woman said, moving to embrace Mrs. Fellows. "I came as quickly as I could when Edward rang me this morning. What on earth happened? He was quite vague on the telephone." Mrs. Fellows introduced her daughter as Margaret Sinclair, and Miss Marple watched with interest as the two women embraced. Margaret's concern appeared genuine, but there was also something else present in her demeanor, a sort of focused intensity, as though she were cataloguing information even as she expressed her worry. "Someone broke in and stole some documents," Mrs. Fellows explained. "Documents regarding the property. I still don't understand why anyone would want them." Margaret's eyes widened, and she shot a glance toward Miss Marple that suggested she had suddenly realized the significance of that detail. "What sort of documents?" she asked carefully. "From my solicitors, regarding the sale of the estate." "The whole estate?" Margaret asked, her voice sharpening. "No, just a portion. I've been considering selling some of the land to a developer. Nothing's been decided yet, but my solicitors were preparing preliminary documents." Margaret sank into a chair, her expression shifting into something that might have been calculation. "Has anything been said to you about who might be interested in acquiring the property?" "Nothing definite," Mrs. Fellows said. "Why? Do you think that's relevant?" Miss Marple, observing this exchange with careful attention, found herself revising her understanding of the situation. Margaret's arrival had seemed coincidental, triggered by Edward's telephone call. But the young woman's intense interest in the documents and the property suggested that perhaps she possessed information that the rest of the household lacked. And there was something in her expression when she asked whether her mother had heard from potential buyers, something that spoke of prior knowledge rather than simple concern. "I wonder," Miss Marple said softly, "whether it might be worth asking whether anyone in the village has recently made inquiries about purchasing land. Sometimes such matters come to the attention of the solicitors before they reach the property owner." Margaret turned to look at Miss Marple, and for a moment the two women's eyes met in a fashion that suggested each had suddenly recognized something important in the other. It was only a brief moment, but it contained within it a shift in the investigation's direction, a subtle reorientation toward possibilities that no one had previously considered. "I'll ring my solicitors this morning," Margaret said decisively. "Mother, you should ask Inspector Graves whether he's made inquiries about potential buyers. If someone knew about the property sale before it was publicly announced, that's certainly relevant to the theft." Mrs. Fellows looked bewildered by her daughter's sudden intensity, but she nodded agreement. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was mentally adjusting her notes yet again. The investigation had expanded in scope, and what had seemed like a simple theft was beginning to reveal itself as something considerably more elaborate, a theft that might itself be merely the visible surface of a much deeper and more personal conflict. Margaret Sinclair proved to be the sort of woman who transformed deliberation into action with remarkable efficiency. By early afternoon, she had spoken with her mother's solicitors, made several telephone calls to contacts in London, and established herself at Christmas Manor's writing desk with a sort of purposeful focus that suggested she had taken complete control of the situation. Mrs. Fellows watched her daughter work with a mixture of relief and bewilderment, as though she had suddenly found herself in the presence of a stranger wearing her daughter's face. It was during one of these telephone conversations that Margaret's expression shifted into something harder, more calculating. She listened intently to whoever was on the other end of the line, made a few brief notes, and then thanked them with the sort of politeness that barely concealed underlying urgency. "Mother," she said, replacing the receiver, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer with complete honesty. Has anyone approached you in recent weeks about selling Christmas Manor or any portion of its land? Anyone at all? Neighbors, developers, individuals claiming to represent investment firms?" Mrs. Fellows shook her head. "No one has approached me directly. I've been the one considering the sale, remember? I contacted my solicitors about what might be involved." "And you didn't mention it to anyone in the village?" "Certainly not," Mrs. Fellows said with some indignation. "One doesn't discuss one's private business affairs with village gossips. Half the high street would know about it within a day." Margaret exchanged a glance with Miss Marple, a glance that conveyed the shared recognition that village gossips were often remarkably efficient at learning things they had ostensibly not been told. "The solicitors mentioned something interesting," Margaret continued. "Apparently, there have been inquiries about Christmas Manor's market value. But these inquiries came through intermediaries, property consultants asking questions on behalf of unnamed clients. The solicitors found it unusual enough to mention it to their contact at the bank. "Which bank?" Miss Marple asked, though she already suspected the answer. "The Ashford Village Bank," Margaret said. "The manager there, a Mr. Gerald Finch, made the initial inquiry. At least he was the one who asked the solicitors about valuation and potential sales terms." Miss Marple felt the pieces begin to shift into a slightly different configuration. A bank manager asking questions about property valuation. Eleanor Ashford, a woman with no verifiable credentials, arriving in the village at precisely the moment when such inquiries were being made. Edward Fellows in financial distress. A stolen document relating to property that might be about to change hands. The connections were becoming clearer, though the ultimate picture remained obscured. "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that it would be worthwhile for Inspector Graves to speak with Mr. Finch about his inquiries. There may be a perfectly innocent explanation, but it does seem rather curious that a bank manager would be investigating property valuations on behalf of unnamed parties." Margaret nodded decisively and moved toward the telephone. But before she could reach it, the drawing-room door opened, and Eleanor Ashford entered with a sort of composure that suggested she had grown accustomed to making dramatic entrances. She was dressed more formally than Miss Marple had seen her the previous evening, in a tailored suit of charcoal grey that lent her an almost austere appearance. "I apologize for the intrusion," Eleanor said, addressing the room with the careful politeness of someone who knew she was not welcome but was determined to maintain professional courtesy. "I felt it necessary to speak with you before matters progress further. I'm leaving Ashford in the Pines this afternoon, and I wanted to ensure you understood why I came here in the first place." Margaret rose from her chair, her hand still extended toward the telephone. "And why did you come here, Miss Ashford?" "Edward Fellows," Eleanor said, settling herself in a chair without being invited to do so, "is not what he claims to be. He is not an investment advisor attempting to rehabilitate his reputation. He is a fraud and quite possibly a criminal. I was retained by investors who lost considerable sums of money to one of Edward's schemes 2 years ago. My task was to locate him and gather evidence of his current activities." Mrs. Fellows made a small sound of distress. Margaret, however, remained perfectly still, watching Eleanor with the intensity of someone who was rapidly revising their assumptions. "You came here under false pretenses," Margaret said. It was not a question. "I did," Eleanor confirmed. "I told Edward that I was a potential investor interested in his current venture. He was foolish enough to explain his plans in detail, apparently believing that I might contribute capital. What he failed to realize was that his current scheme closely mirrors his previous one, a fraudulent investment opportunity designed to separate people from their money." "And the theft last night?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Did you have anything to do with that?" "I did not," Eleanor said firmly. "I was with Edward when it occurred, which is precisely why I remained silent about my true purpose. I realized that someone else had broken in, that someone had stolen documents relating to the property. I suspected then that Edward might be more deeply involved in local criminal activity than I had anticipated. Or," she paused, and there was something almost pointed in her gaze as it moved toward Margaret, "that someone else in this household had their own reasons for wanting those documents removed." The silence that followed Eleanor's statement hung heavy in the room. Outside, the November afternoon had grown grey and cold, and the fire in the drawing-room seemed to burn with less warmth than it had an hour earlier. Miss Marple felt the familiar sensation of approaching clarity, that moment when scattered observations began to coalesce into coherent understanding. "I think," Miss Marple said, breaking the silence with gentle firmness, "that it's time Inspector Graves heard the truth about why Eleanor Ashford came to our village, and perhaps more importantly, why someone broke into this house last night and what they were truly looking for." Inspector Graves arrived at Christmas Manor within the hour, accompanied by a sense of grim determination that suggested he had already begun to suspect that the case was considerably more complex than the preliminary investigation had indicated. He had Eleanor Ashford taken into the study for a formal statement, emerging 40 minutes later with the expression of a man who had just learned that his seemingly straightforward theft investigation had transformed into something far more tangled. "Miss Ashford's story checks out," he informed Miss Marple, Margaret, and Mrs. Fellows, who were waiting in the drawing room with varying degrees of anxiety. "I've contacted her employers in London, and they've confirmed her identity and purpose. She was indeed retained to investigate Edward Fellows' current activities. However, her presence here does not explain the theft." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "but it does suggest that we should reconsider who benefited most from those documents being stolen. Eleanor came to investigate Edward because he is a fraud. But the theft of documents relating to property sales suggests that someone else, someone within this household or closely connected to it, had different motives entirely." Margaret stood and moved to the window, her back to the room. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had reached a decision that she found deeply unpleasant. "I need to tell you something about my mother's financial situation," she said, "and about why I came to Ashford in the Pines quite so urgently this morning." Inspector Graves' attention sharpened immediately. "Go on," he said. "My mother is not as financially secure as she has led people to believe," Margaret said carefully. "My late father's estate was smaller than expected. There were debts, investments that went badly wrong. My mother purchased Christmas Manor using what remained of her capital, and she's been living rather more extravagantly than her actual means warrant. The Christmas parties, the entertaining, it's all been an attempt to maintain an appearance of wealth and stability." Mrs. Fellows made a sound of protest, but Margaret held up a hand. "I only learned the full extent of it when I received a letter from Mother's solicitors 3 weeks ago. They were concerned about her financial trajectory. At the rate she's spending, Christmas Manor will need to be sold within 2 years. The sale of the land would provide a temporary respite, but it wouldn't solve the fundamental problem." "And did you tell anyone of this?" Inspector Graves asked. "I mentioned it to my husband," Margaret said. "Nothing more." "But my husband—" She paused, and the hesitation contained within it all the pain of marital discord. "My husband has been having business difficulties of his own. He's been looking for investment opportunities, ways to increase his capital. When he learned that my mother might be selling property in the Cotswolds, he became very interested indeed." The implication hung in the air like a suspended blade. Miss Marple watched as Inspector Graves' expression shifted as he began to understand the direction in which this conversation was moving. "Your husband asked you to obtain the property documents," the inspector said flatly, "so that he could understand what land your mother was planning to sell and potentially purchase it himself." "No," Margaret said, and the word carried absolute conviction. "My husband asked me to obtain the documents. I refused. I told him it was unconscionable to steal from my own mother. We had a terrible row about it. He said I was being naive, that business worked in ways I didn't understand, that if I wouldn't help him, he would find another way." "And did he?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Margaret turned from the window, and tears were streaming down her face. "I don't know," she said. "I genuinely don't know. I came here this morning to speak with my mother, to warn her that my husband might attempt something foolish. But when I arrived and learned about the theft, I realized that perhaps he had already acted. He left London yesterday morning. He said he had business in the Midlands, but he didn't specify where." Inspector Graves rose from his chair with the purposefulness of someone who had just received the final piece of a puzzle. "I need to make some telephone calls," he said. "Mrs. Sinclair, do you have your husband's schedule? Do you know where he might be staying?" Margaret provided him with her husband's details, and the inspector departed with his constable, leaving behind a drawing-room characterized by the particular silence that follows the revelation of family betrayal. Mrs. Fellows sat rigid in her chair, her face drained of color, her hands clenched in her lap. "I didn't know," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know that Margaret's marriage was in such difficulty. I didn't know that my daughter felt she couldn't confide in me about our financial situation. People often keep such matters hidden, Miss Marple said gently, because they believe they are protecting those they love. Your daughter was protecting you from worry. Your son-in-law was attempting to protect what he perceived as his family's interests. Yet in doing so, both of them created the circumstances for this theft. But even as she spoke these words, Miss Marple found herself uncertain about whether the full truth had yet been revealed. There was still something about the evening of the theft that didn't quite fit, some detail that suggested the situation was even more complex than Margaret's confession had made it seem. The timing was too convenient, the involvement of too many parties with competing motives. And Eleanor Ashford's observation about Margaret's suspicious interest in the stolen documents nagged at Miss Marple's mind like an unresolved chord. She would need to speak with Edward Fellows again, and she would need to ask some rather pointed questions about what he had actually been doing in his room when the theft occurred. Because Miss Marple had begun to suspect that the truth about Christmas Manor's missing documents was considerably more intricate than anyone, including Inspector Graves, had yet imagined. Edward Fellows was in the library when Miss Marple requested to see him, ostensibly reading a newspaper, but in reality staring at the same page he had been staring at for the better part of an hour. He looked up with visible relief when Miss Marple entered, as though grateful for any interruption that might provide respite from his thoughts. He was pale, and there was a tremor in his hands when he set the newspaper aside. "Miss Marple," he said, attempting to summon some semblance of cordiality, "I suppose you've heard the latest developments. My aunt's financial difficulties, Margaret's husband's apparent criminal ambitions. It seems Christmas Manor harbors rather more drama than one would expect from a quiet village residence." "It does indeed," Miss Marple agreed, settling herself in a chair opposite him. "Though I find myself puzzled by certain aspects of the investigation. For instance, I'm rather curious about your own financial situation, Mr. Fellows. Eleanor Ashford came to this village to investigate you, to gather evidence of fraud. Yet you seemed remarkably unconcerned about her presence here, remarkably willing to explain your business activities in detail. That strikes me as either foolish or deliberately calculated." Edward's face flushed. "I made a mistake," he said. "I believed Eleanor genuinely wanted to invest. I was eager to demonstrate that my current venture was legitimate, that I had learned from my previous errors. I should have been more cautious." "Or perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "you knew exactly who Eleanor was from the moment she arrived. Perhaps her presence here was not coincidental at all, but rather something you had orchestrated. After all, having an investigator present to verify your alibi during a theft is considerably more useful than having no alibi whatsoever." Edward stood abruptly, moving to the fireplace with the jerky movements of someone whose control was beginning to fray. "That's ridiculous," he said. "Why would I orchestrate my own theft?" "Because," Miss Marple replied with the same gentle certainty with which she might discuss the weather, "you needed those documents removed from the house. Not because you wanted them destroyed, but because you needed them to disappear so that no one would be able to verify what your aunt was actually planning to do with the property." The silence that followed this statement was profound. Edward did not turn from the fireplace, but his shoulders tensed, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of casual unconcern. "My aunt," he said slowly, "was planning to sell Christmas Manor to a development company. Not just a portion of the land, but the entire estate. The property would be converted into a luxury residential complex. She had been negotiating with them for weeks. But she told people she was only selling a portion," Miss Marple observed. "Because she was ashamed," Edward said, turning to face Miss Marple at last. "Because selling Christmas Manor meant admitting that she had failed, that the life she had constructed was unsustainable. So she told everyone she was simply selling some land, maintaining the fiction that she would remain here, continue her parties, continue being the woman she had convinced herself she was, And you discovered these negotiations, Miss Marple said. How? She left a letter on her desk, Edward admitted. From the development company's solicitors. I read it while looking for something else entirely. When I realized what was happening, I understood that the entire foundation of my aunt's life was about to crumble. And I understood that if anyone discovered the full scope of what she was planning, the speculation would be unbearable. The gossip would be relentless. So you arranged for the documents to be stolen, Miss Marple said, but not by yourself. That would have been too obvious. Instead, you enlisted someone else, someone who had their own reasons for wanting those documents removed. Edward's face crumpled slightly. I didn't know it was Margaret's husband, he said quietly. Eleanor approached me 3 days ago and said she was interested in investing. I recognized her from descriptions provided by mutual acquaintances. I knew she was investigating me. But I also realized that having her here, having her vouch for my whereabouts during the theft, would provide perfect cover. So I agreed to let her stay, knowing that whatever happened, my alibi would be unassailable. And then you contacted Margaret's husband, Miss Marple continued. You told him that documents relating to the property sale were in your aunt's study. You suggested that if he wanted to understand what was happening with Christmas Manor, he would need to obtain those documents. You didn't specify what he should do with them. You simply ensured that he would act. I thought he would photograph them, Edward said desperately. I thought he would gather information and then return them. I never thought anyone would actually steal them. And then when the theft occurred, I realized how badly I had misjudged the situation, how completely I had lost control of events. Miss Marple rose from her chair, her expression containing within it a complex mixture of compassion and disappointment. You manipulated events with the intention of protecting your aunt's dignity, she said. But in doing so, you created a situation in which theft became inevitable. You involved yourself in criminal conspiracy, however well-intentioned your motives might have been. And you placed Eleanor Ashford in a position where she became, however briefly, an unwitting accomplice to fraud. What will happen now? Edward asked, and his voice carried the hollow desperation of someone who already knew the answer. Inspector Graves will need to speak with you regarding your involvement in this matter, Miss Marple said. The truth, uncomfortable as it is, will emerge. Your aunt will learn that you attempted to protect her through deception. Margaret will understand that her husband's criminal actions were made possible by information you provided. And Christmas Manor, which has already undergone so much transformation, will undergo yet another. But perhaps, she added, with a small note of something that might have been hope, this painful revelation will provide an opportunity for honesty that was not possible before. She moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing, Mr. Fellows. Eleanor Ashford did not betray your confidence to protect you. She withheld information because she recognized what you were attempting to do, and she understood that your motives, however misguided, came from a place of genuine concern. That is a form of mercy, and it is more than many people deserve. Inspector Graves returned to Christmas Manor as the afternoon light was beginning its descent toward evening, his expression suggesting that he had spent the intervening hours in telephone conversations that had simultaneously clarified certain matters while complicating others considerably. He found Miss Marple in the drawing room with Mrs. Fellows and Margaret, the three women seated in a configuration that suggested they had been engaged in the sort of serious conversations that characterized moments of significant family reckoning. "We've located Margaret's husband," Inspector Graves announced, settling himself into a chair with the weariness of someone who had spent considerable effort in pursuit of facts that were proving increasingly difficult to organize into coherent narrative. He's in Cheltenham, staying in a hotel under an assumed name. He has in his possession documents that match the description of those stolen from Christmas Manor, along with architectural plans and property valuations that suggest he was attempting to understand the financial implications of the property sale. Mrs. Fellows made a small sound of distress, but Margaret reached over and took her mother's hand with a firmness that suggested she had moved beyond shock into the more practical territory of acceptance and remediation. "Has he confessed?" Margaret asked. "Not precisely," Inspector Graves said. "He's denying involvement in the actual theft, claiming that he received the documents from an intermediary, and that he was simply attempting to understand what was happening with the property. However, we've identified a local man, a handyman who sometimes works at Christmas Manor, who has admitted to breaking in and stealing the documents. He claims he was paid £50 to do so, and the person who paid him was your husband." The inspector turned to Margaret as he spoke, and there was in his gaze a particular quality of sympathy mixed with professional obligation. "Your husband will face charges related to theft and conspiracy. The handyman will face charges for the actual break-in. As for Mr. Fellows," he gestured toward Edward, who had appeared in the doorway as the inspector was speaking, "we have some questions regarding his knowledge of and involvement in these events." Edward stepped fully into the room, and Miss Marple observed that he appeared to have made a decision. His face had taken on the appearance of someone who had chosen a particular course of action and was determined to see it through, regardless of the consequences. "I wish to make a full statement regarding my involvement in this matter," he said. "Not to avoid responsibility, but because I believe Miss Marple has helped me understand that prolonging the deception will only cause further damage." What followed was a detailed confession that took nearly an hour to record, during which Edward outlined his discovery of his aunt's plans, his recognition of Eleanor Ashford, his decision to use the inevitable theft as cover for protecting his aunt's secret, and his belief that he was acting in service of a greater good by ensuring that the full scope of Mrs. Fellows's financial difficulties would not become the subject of village gossip. When he had finished speaking, Inspector Graves set down his notebook and looked at Mrs. Fellows with an expression that suggested he was attempting to reconcile the image of a woman desperately protecting her public reputation with the image of a woman capable of deceiving her entire household about her financial circumstances. "Mrs. Fellows," he said carefully, "I must ask whether you were aware of your nephew's actions. Did you know that he had orchestrated this theft?" "I most certainly did not," Mrs. Fellows said, with a vehemence that appeared entirely genuine. "Though I confess I should have realized that something was amiss. Edward has always been someone who believed that problems could be solved through clever maneuvering rather than honest confrontation. It's a family trait, I'm afraid, one that my late husband possessed in abundance and that I seem to have inherited despite my best efforts to overcome it." She turned to look at her nephew, and her expression contained within it layers of emotion that were difficult to pass. Disappointment, gratitude, anger, and something that might have been a grudging recognition of the fundamental similarity between them. "You thought you were protecting me," she said, "but what you actually did was prevent me from confronting the consequences of my own decisions. Had I been forced to admit that Christmas Manor was being sold in its entirety, had I been forced to acknowledge my financial circumstances to this village, it would have been uncomfortable. It would have been humiliating, but it would have been honest." Miss Marple, observing this exchange from her position near the window, found herself reflecting on the curious ways that families managed to wound one another with the very intentions that were supposed to heal. Edward's attempt to protect his aunt had resulted in theft and conspiracy. Margaret's attempt to handle her marital difficulties quietly had resulted in her husband committing a crime, and Mrs. Fellows' attempt to maintain a carefully constructed image had resulted in her nephew and her daughter becoming entangled in criminal activity designed to preserve that image. "There is one matter that remains unclear to me," Miss Marple said softly, and everyone in the room turned to look at her with the particular attention that tends to be paid to someone who is about to offer enlightenment. "The handyman who committed the actual theft. What was his name, Inspector?" "Robert Winters," Inspector Graves replied. "Local man, works various jobs around the village. Why do you ask?" "Because," Miss Marple said, "I'm curious about how Margaret's husband came to know this man. Winters is not someone one would naturally encounter in London. Someone must have recommended him or facilitated the connection somehow. The implications of this observation hung in the air like a physical presence. Inspector Graves' expression shifted, and he began rapidly making notes in his notebook. Edward's face had gone very pale, and Margaret, who had been maintaining a careful composure throughout the proceedings, suddenly rose from her chair and moved toward the door. "I need to speak with you privately," she said to the inspector. "There's something about my husband's visit to Ashford-in-the-Pines that I haven't mentioned. Something that might explain how he came to know Robert Winters." As Margaret and the inspector departed the drawing-room, Miss Marple settled herself back into a chair and exchanged a meaningful glance with Mrs. Fellows. The mystery of the theft at Christmas Manor was not yet fully resolved. There were still connections to be made, still secrets to be uncovered, and Miss Marple had the distinct impression that the most significant revelation was yet to come. Margaret returned to the drawing-room 20 minutes later, her composure visibly shaken, her face bearing the particular pallor of someone who had just been forced to confront a truth that fundamentally altered her understanding of her own life. Inspector Graves followed behind her, and his expression suggested that whatever Margaret had revealed had transformed the investigation in ways that were both professionally significant and personally troubling. "My husband," Margaret said, settling herself back into her chair with movements that suggested considerable effort, "has been conducting an affair with someone in this village. That's why he was so interested in the property sale. That's how he came to know Robert Winters. He met Winters through the woman with whom he's been involved." The name hung unspoken in the room, but Miss Marple found she already knew what it was before Margaret spoke it aloud. There had been something about Eleanor Ashford's sudden decision to leave the village, something about the intensity with which she had observed the interactions within Christmas Manor's drawing-room, something that had suggested connections beyond the simple investigation of Edward's fraudulent schemes. "Eleanor Ashford," Margaret said, confirming Miss Marple's deduction. "They met in London 6 months ago. My husband said it was nothing serious, just a temporary distraction from his business concerns. But when I learned that Eleanor was coming to Ashford-in-the-Pines, when I understood that she was somehow connected to Edward, I began to suspect that her appearance in the village was not coincidental. I confronted my husband about it when he left London yesterday. That's when he told me everything, about Eleanor, about Robert Winters, about how Eleanor had been helping him understand the financial implications of the property sale." "Did Eleanor Ashford know that your husband intended to commit theft?" Inspector Graves asked, his voice carrying a note of careful neutrality that barely concealed his professional interest. "She claims not to have known," Margaret said, "but I'm not certain I believe her. When I told the inspector about my husband's affair, Eleanor admitted that she had deliberately withheld this information from the investigation. She said she didn't want my husband's indiscretion to become public knowledge, that she was trying to protect my family's privacy." Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the curious morality of Eleanor Ashford's actions. Here was a woman who had come to Ashford-in-the-Pines to investigate fraud, who had observed criminal conspiracy developing around her, who had chosen to remain silent about certain facts, because she believed she was protecting someone from unnecessary harm. It was a form of selective honesty that revealed as much about Eleanor's own character as it did about her understanding of human complexity. "I would like to speak with Miss Ashford before she leaves the village," Miss Marple said to Inspector Graves. "I believe there are certain matters that would benefit from clarification, matters that go beyond the formal scope of a police investigation but are nonetheless important to understanding what has actually occurred here." Inspector Graves appeared to consider this request with the sort of careful deliberation that suggested he understood what Miss Marple was asking for, without her needing to be entirely explicit. "I can arrange that," he said, "though I should warn you that Miss Ashford has made it clear she intends to depart this afternoon. Her train leaves at 4:30. "Eleanor Ashford," was located in the morning room, where she was completing the final stages of her packing with the methodical efficiency of someone who had become accustomed to rapid departures. She looked up when Miss Marple entered, and there was in her expression a particular quality of resignation that suggested she had been expecting this confrontation since the moment Margaret had confessed her suspicions. "I suppose you've come to ask why I didn't reveal my connection to Margaret's husband," Eleanor said, continuing to fold her clothes with careful attention. "The answer is rather more complicated than simple discretion or loyalty. You see, Miss Marple, I came to Ashford in the Pines to investigate Edward Fellows, but I also came because of Margaret's husband. He's been involved in financial fraud for years. My original intention was to gather evidence against him as well, to ensure that he faced consequences for his actions. But when I arrived and began to understand the broader situation, I realized that exposing him would destroy Margaret's marriage and, quite possibly, her life." "So you chose to protect her," Miss Marple observed. "I chose to protect her from a truth that I believed would cause her more harm than good," Eleanor said. "I knew that Margaret's husband had connections to Robert Winters. I suspected that he might be planning something criminal, but I didn't know the specifics. And when the theft occurred, when I understood that Margaret's husband had indeed committed a crime, I had to make a decision. I could reveal everything I knew, or I could allow events to unfold in a way that might ultimately prove less destructive." "You allowed yourself to become complicit in order to prevent greater harm," Miss Marple said. "That's a form of moral calculation that not everyone would make." "And was it the right decision?" Eleanor asked, and there was genuine uncertainty in her voice. "I'm still not entirely certain. Margaret will now have to live with the knowledge that her husband's affair led directly to a crime. She'll have to decide whether to remain in her marriage or leave it. And none of that would have happened if I had simply reported what I knew to the police at the beginning." Miss Marple moved to the window and looked out at the November afternoon, at the bare trees and grey sky of Ashford in the Pines. "The problem with moral calculations," she said slowly, "is that we can never truly know whether we've made the correct choice. We can only know that we've made the choice that seemed most aligned with our understanding of what was right. Edward believed he was protecting his aunt. Your husband believed he was protecting his business interests. Eleanor believed she was protecting Margaret, and in each case, the attempt to prevent harm resulted in harm being done. Perhaps the lesson is not whether we made the right decision, but that decisions made with incomplete information are always, by definition, imperfect." Eleanor set down the dress she was folding and looked at Miss Marple with something approaching admiration. "You're not going to judge me," she said. It was not a question. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "I'm much too old to judge anyone. But I do hope you'll consider that sometimes honesty, however painful, causes less long-term damage than deception, however well-intentioned." Eleanor Ashford departed Ashford in the Pines on the 4:30 train, her departure marked only by the quiet closing of a taxi door and the steady rhythm of wheels on gravel. Miss Marple watched from the platform with the vicar, who had come to see her off with the sort of pastoral concern that suggested he still believed Eleanor capable of redemption despite her moral ambiguities. The train pulled away into the grey afternoon, carrying with it the last vestiges of mystery that had disrupted the village's orderly existence. By evening, the facts of the case had been arranged into the particular configuration that satisfied official requirements, though Miss Marple remained aware that official satisfaction and complete truth were not always synonymous. Margaret's husband had been charged with conspiracy and theft. Robert Winters had been charged with breaking and entering. Edward Fellows had been charged with conspiracy and accessory after the fact, though his cooperation had ensured that his sentence would likely be considerably lighter than it might otherwise have been. Eleanor Ashford, as an investigator acting in the pursuit of exposing genuine fraud, had been allowed to depart without formal charges, though everyone involved understood that her actions had, at minimum, involved withholding critical information from a police investigation. The drawing room of Christmas Manor had taken on the appearance of a place where a significant transformation had occurred. Mrs. Fellows sat in one of her uncomfortable chairs, but her posture had shifted. Her shoulders were no longer quite so rigidly held, her hands no longer quite so deliberately positioned. Edward stood near the fireplace, and Margaret occupied the space between her mother and her nephew, a physical embodiment of the bridges she had begun, however tentatively, to build between the revelations and the path forward. "I have made certain decisions," Mrs. Fellows said to Miss Marple, who had been invited to tea as a sort of conclusion to the events that had disrupted the household. "I've contacted the development company and confirmed that I wish to proceed with the sale of Christmas Manor. I've also," she paused, and there was visible effort in the words that followed, "informed the village that I will be relocating to a smaller house in the south of England. I've decided to stop pretending to be something I'm not, to stop attempting to maintain an image that bears no relationship to my actual circumstances." "That seems a wise decision," Miss Marple said gently, "though I suspect it will be an uncomfortable one." "Enormously uncomfortable," Mrs. Fellows agreed. "The gossip will be relentless. People will speculate about my finances, about why I'm leaving, about whether I've suffered some catastrophic loss. But at least," she added with a small smile that suggested she had found something approaching peace in this acceptance, "it will be based on truth rather than maintained fiction." Margaret reached over and took her mother's hand, a gesture that seemed to surprise Mrs. Fellows pleasantly. "I've made some decisions as well," Margaret said. "I'm separating from my husband, not immediately, not in anger, but with the clear understanding that a marriage built on deception and enabled by compromise cannot continue. I'm moving back to London, and I'm going to focus on my own interests rather than attempting to manage his ambitions." "That also seems wise," Miss Marple observed, "though I imagine it will be painful as well." "Everything that matters is painful," Margaret said with the particular directness of someone who had been stripped of comfortable illusions and found herself oddly lighter for the loss. "The only question is whether the pain leads to growth or merely to deeper entrenchment in patterns that don't serve us." Edward, who had remained silent until this point, finally spoke. "I've been offered a position with a firm in Bristol," he said. "Legitimate work, proper salary, nothing exceptional but nothing fraudulent either. It's considerably less glamorous than my previous ambitions, but it appears to be what I actually need rather than what I imagine I want." Miss Marple noted that Edward did not apologize again, did not attempt to rehabilitate his image or minimize his culpability. This absence of performative contrition struck her as more genuine than any elaborate speech of remorse could have been. He had understood, finally, what Eleanor and Margaret and Mrs. Fellows had all come to understand in their various ways, that the attempt to construct and maintain a false self was ultimately more exhausting and more destructive than simply accepting who one actually was. "I should be going," Miss Marple said, setting down her teacup. "I suspect you'll all benefit from some time alone as a family." But before she rose to leave, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the curious way that the investigation had unfolded. There had been no dramatic moment of revelation, no moment in which she had gathered everyone together and explained the solution with the careful precision of a mathematical proof. Instead, the truth had emerged gradually, layer by layer, each person's deception and motive revealing something about the others until a picture had formed that was comprehensive without being entirely satisfying. That was the nature of human truth, Miss Marple had long ago concluded. It was never as neat as one might wish it to be. There were always loose ends, always ambiguities, always the knowledge that one's understanding of events was provisional and subject to revision. But there was also, in that very messiness, a kind of authenticity that could not be achieved through any other means. The village of Ashford-in-the-Pines resumed its ordinary rhythms over the following weeks. Christmas came and went without the elaborate party that Mrs. Fellows had planned, replaced instead by a quiet gathering at the vicar's house where the emphasis was on genuine connection rather than social display. The sale of Christmas Manor progressed through its legal channels, and by February, the developers had begun their preliminary surveys of the property. Edward departed for Bristol with the sort of quietness that suggested he was grateful to be leaving the village where his ambitions had been exposed. Margaret began her new life in London, writing letters to her mother that contained genuine warmth rather than the dutiful affection that had characterized their previous correspondence. And Miss Marple, sitting in her study on a cold December evening, added a final entry to her journal regarding the matter of Christmas Manor. She wrote, "The theft was solved not through forensic examination or logical deduction of physical evidence, but through understanding that all the principal actors were engaged in the same fundamental project, the attempt to maintain an image that bore no relationship to their actual circumstances." Edward sought to protect his aunt from shame. Margaret sought to protect her husband's reputation. Mrs. Fellows sought to protect her position in village society. Eleanor sought to protect Margaret from truth. And in each case, the protection proved destructive. Perhaps the lesson is that we do the most damage when we are most convinced of our own good intentions. Honesty, painful as it may be, seems to cause considerably less long-term harm than deception, no matter how benevolent its source. She closed the journal and sat for a moment in the quiet of her study, listening to the sound of rain against the windows. Outside, the English countryside was dark and cold, the sort of night that made one grateful for warmth and safety, and the company of those who had learned, through difficult experience, the value of simple truth. Christmas Manor would soon cease to exist in any meaningful sense, transformed into a development of modern homes that would erase its particular history. But the events that had occurred within its walls had left their mark on the people involved, a mark that would shape their choices and their relationships for years to come. That, Miss Marple reflected, was perhaps the real significance of the investigation. Not that a theft had been solved and perpetrators identified, but that a household of people, through confrontation with deception and its consequences, had been forced to begin the difficult work of becoming more authentically themselves. It was late in the evening when Miss Marple finally extinguished the lamps and prepared for bed. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, she found herself thinking of Eleanor Ashford, somewhere in London, continuing her work of investigating fraud and exposing deception. The young woman had learned, in her brief time in Ashford in the Pines, that the pursuit of truth was more complicated than she had imagined, that honesty sometimes required silence, and that the most important victories were often the quiet ones achieved through understanding rather than confrontation. Miss Marple settled into her bed with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed human nature in all its contradictory complexity, and had found, in that complexity, something approaching wisdom. The mystery of Christmas Manor was closed, filed away among all the other small mysteries of village life that accumulated over the years like leaves settling into soil, becoming eventually the rich substrate from which understanding grew. Outside, the December night continued its work of darkness and silence, and in the morning, Ashford in the Pines would wake to another day of ordinary concerns and hidden dramas, unaware that its greatest lesson had come not from any dramatic event, but from the simple, painful, necessary revelation of truth.